eGestalt's webinar, How to Manage Security Risk for Your Business. Demystify, Understand, and Implement. Today's presenter is Anupam Sahai, co-founder and president of eGestalt. Anupam is an accomplished management, marketing, and technology leader with 21 plus years of experience directing teams to develop and launch globally renowned products, generating up to hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Prior to eGestalt, Anupam was vice president marketing for HIPAA Inc. He is a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare, IT, cloud computing, security and compliance, networking, and is a featured speaker at several industry conferences worldwide. Now, we want to tailor this webinar and our future webinars to suit our audience, so we're going to ask 3 demographic questions in the form of a poll. And you can find the poll in your GoToWebinar admin section. I will go ahead and launch the first question. And the first question is, what is your current status? Go ahead and vote. Covered entity, business associate, service provider, or other. And again, these answers will help us tailor this webinar and all of our future webinars. And I will be closing the poll in about 5 seconds. Please go ahead and submit your vote here. Okay, let me share the results. So what is your current status? 50% are business associate, followed by service provider. Let me launch the second question. What is your position? Executive, compliance related, risk, privacy related, IT related, or other? And again, these answers help us tailor this webinar and all of our future webinars. So please help us out and vote. All right. I'll give you about 5 more seconds here to vote. Okay, let me close the poll, and I'll share the results. What is your position? 40% executive, followed by compliance-related, risk, privacy-related. Okay, and our last question here. This one's easy. Have you undergone a security risk analysis? Simply yes or no. Go ahead and vote. Wow. Okay, this is surprising, but it's also good, I guess. Have you undergone a security risk analysis? With 85% people voting, the answer was yes, 100%, yes. Great. Well, thank you all for voting. And we are going to record this webinar as well, and we'll put it up on eGestalt's website after the webinar. There's Anupam's information. Should you need to contact him with any questions, feel free to email him. I guess that's it. That's it for my time, Anupam. I'll turn the webinar over to you now. Anupam, are you there?
Hi. Yeah, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the webinar today. So in terms of the topics that I will cover today, I will talk about the definition of security risk analysis and really the motivation behind doing so in your organization. Looks like a number of you have already gone through the process, but I want to talk about the elements involved in doing a security risk analysis, what are the steps involved, and I would take HIPAA as a sample example to essentially walk you through what it takes to do a security risk analysis if you're interested in doing HIPAA security risk analysis. And then I'll talk about what are the real-world experiences, what are the best practices, how to go about doing security risk analysis so that you have a complete view of risk management as a framework. And this is a fairly complicated topic, so I will try to do my best to demystify the different steps, the different variables required to really be able to move forward with confidence. And then I'll talk about Qaegify, which is an automated tool for security and compliance management. And one of the key services offered by Qaegify is security risk management. And at the end, we'll do a Q&A. Before I start out, let me make some disclaimers that the information presented here is subjective to interpretation. They've been derived from a number of standard bodies like NIST, HIPAA, HITECH, which continues to evolve. And while we've tried our best to make it as accurate as possible, we are not attorneys, and if there is anything legal that you're going through, that would require a different set of attention to detail. But this information is correct to the best of our knowledge with the above caveats. So let's start out by describing the need and the motivation for doing security risk analysis. And the need really comes in from two different fronts. There is the security angle, where you're trying to look at the data breaches that are happening. And if you look at the statistics that's out there, there are about 5 to 15 million identities being stolen every month. And that comes from about 10 to 25 incidents that are happening every month. Oops, sorry about that. So there is a huge cybersecurity problem that you're trying to avert and avoid by taking steps to deal with the cyber attackers. And if you dive into the cybersecurity breach problem, about 52% of the incidents happen because of hacking. And these are hackers who are sophisticated. It literally takes them seconds and minutes to break in and steal all the data, while businesses take about weeks and months to discover that there was a breach, and by that time it's too late because things have already left the premises. So it's a symmetric battle where the cyber attackers have an unfair advantage. So it behooves us to take precautions and take the necessary steps to deal with preventing such breaches. There are some insider privilege misuse related breaches as well, but most of the breaches happen because of attackers exploiting either malware or some lost passwords and credentials. And these hackers are motivated primarily by financial motives. You can see 75% of them are driven by financial motives. They compromise devices, servers, and break in to steal data that's precious to the organization. And as I said earlier, it takes months to discover that the breach has happened, and most of the breaches were discovered by external parties when they request certain information. So another important statistic that is a little surprising is that, or rather counterintuitive, is that most of these breaches are avoidable if businesses spend some time to put together some simple and intermediate controls to prevent these breaches from happening. Now, the other aspect of the need or the motivation for security risk analysis comes from regulations. And if you look at regulations like HIPAA, HITECH, PCI, they all require some degree of security risk analysis to be done. And if you look at the HIPAA HITECH, which is the healthcare vertical industry regulation coming from the Department of Health and Human Services, there is the security rule, which essentially requires a set of security guidelines, which can be broken down into 4 different categories. There are administrative procedures, there are physical safeguards, there are technical security services, and technical security mechanisms. So these security processes are required to be put in place to deal with protection of patient health information, or any devices or any people who deal with PHI is protected and safeguarded by these processes. And one of the requirements from the HIPAA security rule is the 164.308 regulation requirement, which requires that a risk analysis be conducted to prevent PHI. So the requirements for security risk analysis, as I said earlier, comes from the need to protect the organization from security breaches. It can also be mandated by sorry about that, by regulation. So the business risk really comes from both the security and compliance angles, and as an organization, you want to prevent and comply with both these requirements so that you are able to minimize the business risk exposure. So having said that, let me jump into what does risk mean, and I'll start out with some definitions. I'll talk about what comprises risk, the risk management framework, what are the different elements in it, and what are the different steps required to achieve security risk analysis and to manage the whole process. So starting out with some definition, what is risk? So risk is really a measure to which an entity or a business is threatened by an external event or an hacker, and the resultant impact that particular hacker could have on the organization. And if somebody steals the data, that's a very adverse effect. And if they steal crown jewels of the organization related to intellectual property, related to patient health information, which is very crucial and critical for the business, that's a big risk. And so it all comes down to, from an information security perspective, it all comes down to stealing of certain critical data and information. And it could also be certain critical information access systems might be affected or impaired because of loss of availability or integrity of the data. So the effect of the hacker or of the adversary of the threat could be related to loss of data, loss of integrity of the data, loss of availability of data, or breach of confidentiality. So all of those are valid forms of loss of information. So the risk assessment process is the process of identifying, estimating, and prioritizing the security risk required to deal with such eventuality. So the question becomes, why conduct risk analysis? So the purpose of risk analysis is to figure out the weak links in the organization. You know, which systems, which vulnerabilities exist that can potentially be exploited by attackers. Attackers could be insiders who are malicious, or outsiders who are malicious, or it could be accidental misuse. And failure to conduct the risk analysis could, as I said earlier, could result in security breaches. It could, it's been shown that average cost of a breach, which includes remediation, is roughly about $5.5 million, with roughly the cost being $194 per record. This is all documented from market research. So the cost is a huge penalty that you are trying to not only come back up from the damage that might have been caused by the stolen data. And so a lot of this is dealing with loss of information and dealing with liabilities that might come about as a result of the loss. Compliance regulations, as I said earlier, HIPAA, HITECH, PCI, FISMA, SOX, all of these require some degree of risk analysis. And this is typically a way that you can quantify the ROI for doing security and compliance related issues and can justify a budget using what the ROI would be or what the potential risk exposure is in case certain steps are not taken to remediate the gaps of the risk exposure that the company has when it comes to the crown jewels of the organization. So if we kind of peel the onion and go to the next level as to what is risk management. So risk management involves identifying and determining the threats either today or later. It requires looking at the weak links or the vulnerabilities that can be exploited by these threats and the potential impact of these exploits. It also looks into what kind of steps or controls can businesses take to deal with such vulnerabilities and the threats that are possible, and evaluating all of that in a continuous fashion, because threats and assets change, new people come in, new devices come in, new assets come in, and the ability to look at an organizational risk posture in a continuous fashion is key, so that as an organization, you or your customers are able to be on top of what the latest posture is. So this is all part of risk management. Certainly risk assessment is the process of identifying the issues that are gaps that are found, and managing all those gaps found through remediation is a key step to making a risk management program be active. So looking at some examples of breaches, one of the questions that we get asked is, do we really need to be worried about it? Are breaches isolated? So the answer is yes, this is a cause of worry. And organizations, small or large, are affected by it. Even state-level agencies and governments are affected by breaches. And this is very simply because the cyber attackers have become much more organized. They have much more sophisticated tools. And as I mentioned earlier, it literally takes them seconds and minutes to steal the data, and it takes weeks and months for businesses to figure out that they have been breached. And often, but in the majority of the cases, small to medium businesses are the targets of these cyber attackers because they're not well prepared, and they act as gateways into the bigger organizations. So examples abound where data breaches have happened, liability lawsuits have taken place. And if you look at Utah breach, Alaska breach, look at the total breach from information from HHS, 22 million records have been breached over the last 1 year from about 600 odd breaches. And if you look at the HHS website, which records all the breaches that are taking place on a regular basis, anywhere between 720 to 990 breaches happen every month. This is the official record, and so this is fairly common. So let's dive into this in a bit more detail, and let's try to get to a risk management model. Let's understand what are the things that can constitute risk frameworks, and come up with a set of steps that are required by businesses to deal with security risk analysis. So let's talk about the risk management triad, the trio, and there are 3 steps that comprise any risk management framework. The first step is the evaluation and assessment, where as an organization you're trying to assess and identify all the assets that are important to you, all the assets that with certain properties and characteristics that are important to the organization. That's the first step. Those are the critical assets. Then the next step is to evaluate threats and vulnerabilities that might be affecting these assets that were identified. And once these threats and vulnerabilities are identified for these particular assets, that leads to a set of risk exposure, which are gaps that need to be mitigated to fix the problem, fix the gaps, so that it's in a manageable fashion. So if you were to look at the risk factors that comprise the risk management framework, there are threats, there are vulnerabilities, and the combination of threat and vulnerability causes an impact with a certain likelihood. The impact is clearly adverse, which means data is stolen, data is taken away, and there's a certain probability or likelihood of that happening. And predisposing condition is essentially a part of impact and likelihood, where certain assets might be predisposed to being attacked, being compromised, versus the others. And so, for example, if a machine is sitting on the internet, that's more prone to be attacked by hackers versus a machine sitting inside a server room, not on the network, which is much more protected. So predisposing condition is is another variable to look into to compute the risk assessment factors involved. So what is a threat? Let's dive into each of the variables and kind of define them so that we are all in the same vocabulary. So a threat is a circumstance or event that will adversely impact the organization. It could be impact in terms of loss of data, it could be operations, it could be individuals or anything critical to the organization. And types of threat sources include, a cyber attacker. It could be a human error, inadvertent error, or it could be some structural failure in the organizational processes, or it could be man-made disasters like accidents, failures, earthquakes, what have you. All of those are part of the threat estimation and computation. Next comes vulnerability. Vulnerability is essentially a weakness in the system. So in the case of a IT asset, it could be patches that are not installed. It could be some software bugs that are predisposed to being exploited. And I mentioned earlier that predisposing condition could either make it more amenable to being exploited or less. So there is a predisposing condition that can add or decrease risks based on how it's configured. Likelihood is really the chance that the threat and vulnerability can be exploited, and it basically is really a capability of the adversary or the threat to exploit this vulnerability, and there's a likelihood chance that this particular threat will be able to exploit the vulnerability, which needs to be computed. And this, of course, is with respect to a specific time frame. So, certain exploits can happen now, next 6 months. So there is a time period required to assess the likelihood and the potential fallout of that. Now, the impact is really the fallout of a threat exploiting a vulnerability with a certain likelihood. And impact is a measure of the severity of the result of an exploit happening. And this could be this can be caused because of loss of data. It can be because of change of integrity of data, or it could be systems going down, which is called availability being not there. So looking at all these variables that I talked about, threat, vulnerability, assets, likelihood, and impact, are key parts of key variables that figure out in the overall risk management framework and model that is shown here. So this is how it all adds up, right? So we have a threat source, which is a cyber attacker or insider. They have certain characteristics, which are capabilities. They might have an intent to exploit and to misuse the data. And the threat essentially initiates a set of threat events, or which is a sequence of activities or exploits. And they exploit vulnerabilities in the system, which causes adverse impact with the likelihood, which essentially is the risk computation. And these assets which have these vulnerabilities might have some predisposing conditions and some controls and some measures that are put in place by the organization, which may or may not be effective to retard or to slow down the attackers. So it's really a battle between the attackers and the who are exploiting vulnerabilities and the controls that the organization has put in place to deal and prevent such attacks. And really the risk is a combination of evaluation of these forces, which are either helping the organization or against the organization, and risk is an estimation of what the overall risk posture would be in this kind of a mixed scenario. So what we are talking about really is the ability for any risk management model to look at these combinations of 6 variables, We are looking at assets, threats, vulnerabilities, which have a certain likelihood and impact, and then controls up measures that are taken by the organization to prevent such threats and vulnerabilities to be exploited for the assets concerned. So in order to compute the risk, either one can start out by looking at assets and identify the threats and vulnerabilities that they face to come up with a risk sort of risk model, risk number, and then work on mitigating the risks found by putting together suitable controls if they're missing. So that's the asset-based risk management model. There's also the threat-based risk management model, which is to identify the threats that a business faces, and that kind of tells you the vulnerabilities and the assets that might be affected by it, and come up with a risk and a mitigation strategy that way. So the idea here is that you can look at the 6 tuples in any order. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you're trying to figure out the combinations of the 6 variables that affect risk in some form or the other. And the risk management model should support either of these approaches to be enumerated, to be ascertained as part of the risk management analysis. So let's jump right into it and kind of make it more real in terms of how would a practitioner or an IT manager or a risk manager would go about looking at these basic concepts and put together a risk management framework for a company. So this is kind of an eye chart, but this is really the set of steps that any risk practitioner would be going through. So we are talking about the steps right here in the middle, where you're talking, you start out by looking at system categorization, which is essentially identifying all the systems that are critical to the organization. It could be hardware, software, people, any other processes that are critical to the organization. Is a system is an asset that needs to be protected. And the second thing is to then identify the threats and vulnerabilities. Threats could be historical. It could be coming from any databases. Vulnerabilities could be, again, based on prior assessments. It could be based on the vulnerability scans that you might do. And then by looking at the asset, threats, and vulnerabilities, then you're looking at controls that are in place today, either currently in place or planned, so that you know what kind of protection mechanism has the organization taken to prevent the critical assets that are important to the company. And once you have this 4 variables listed out, the 2 remaining variables are likelihood and impact, which is essentially the possibility of these exploits taking place given the control measures that the organization has already put together. And once you have that, you have the threat vulnerability, the disruptive force, and the control is more of the protective force. Then you're able to look at the overall risk value, which gives you the current risk exposure for the business. And the result of that will be a set of controls or steps that the business needs to take to prevent whatever risk exposure remains in spite of the controls that might have been there today or planned today. There might be additional controls that are needed to plug the gaps and to solve the problem. So this is a one sequence of steps required to do the risk management, and this needs to be repeated, as you can imagine, on a regular basis to ensure that the risk status is maintained or risk posture is assessed continuously and maintained so that it cannot be exploited. Let me show you the HIPAA steps required and map it to the HIPAA steps required. So, the first state is to figure out all the EPHI assets that are in the organization that need to be protected. The first step is to identify all the EPHI assets. EPHI stands for Electronic Protected Health Information related assets. These are the critical assets for a HIPAA organization. The second step and the third step is to identify threats and vulnerabilities. And again, there are corresponding requirements in HIPAA to controls-wise to deal with this. And then step 4 is to assess the current security controls, which are in place, which are not in place, so that you have a measure of that. And then look at likelihood and impact, and that gives you a risk determination value. So the steps that I talked about, the 9 steps, are also part of, in some form or the other, also part of any security best practice or risk management model, or it's also part of any regulation that is interested in doing security risk analysis. And the key here is to do periodic reviews and updates to the risk posture so that you have a risk management framework and implementation in place. So once you have all of those assessed and the steps taken, then it comes down to how do you know and quantify the risk value. So risk, and this is, by the way, subjective. There are different models and different proposals. But in one form, you can look at risk as a combination of asset impact likelihood for that asset to be compromised, and higher the value of the asset, the higher the risk that you want to mitigate and minimize. And impact and likelihood can be a combination of qualitative or quantitative numbers. In this case, it's a qualitative. It goes from very low to very high, and so does impact. So you can figure out what the qualitative measure is. You can also make it quantitative, where you can assign weights to threats and likelihood, threat likelihood and impact, and thereby come up with a multiplier to the asset, which will then give you a high, medium, low kind of a rating for risk. So again, the intention here is to quantify risk, to measure risk through the variables, 6 variables that I talked about, so that you have an effective way of quantifying risk, and then you can go about mitigating risk that the organization faces. So that's the framework, that's the model. Let me talk about Qaegify now, which is a complete security and compliance management solution that supports multiple compliance frameworks. It supports vulnerability management. It supports multiple vulnerability. It supports vulnerability management as a service. It of course has asset management and risk management that allows you to do the whole process automation that I talked about. And it comes built in with best practices, policy, and procedure templates that you can use. So the scenarios that the tool supports, Qaegify, certainly security and compliance management is a key scenario where you want to make sure that you're able to automate the whole process of assessment of security and compliance and then manage it using a simple click of a button. On the risk management side, the process that I talked about, the 9-step process, which involves looking at all the variables, all of this is automated, and there's pre-canned data information available so that as a practitioner, you don't have to do all of that. The system will pre-populate the sort of threats and vulnerabilities based on your profile. And so your time to manage, create a risk management framework and model, and to maintain it is very minimal. It also supports vendor management, which is again required by certain regulations. For HIPAA, for example, requires BA management to be in place. So it's all built into the tool. This is a continuous security and compliance workflow supported by the tool. And so as a business who's not used Qaegify, you would typically start out here, where you would do a security scan, you will do a self-assessment and a risk assessment, where you will then have a gap report with risk exposure priorities, and you know which which assets are more exposed than the others. Once you know that, the system will then tell you and guide you through a remediation plan, which will involve putting together some new controls. It will tell you to put new policies and contracts that are again pre-populated in the tool, that you can either, if you're an end customer, you can work with service providers that work with you, or if you have internal IT managers, you can leverage the documents that are in there. And Qaegify today is sold through channel partners, so typically our channel partners will work with end customers to help put together the remediation plan, help interpret the gaps and the risk exposure that was found. And once you do the remediation, then you need to go back and do an assessment again to essentially understand and implement any gaps that might still be pending. And you can repeat this cycle in an ongoing continuous fashion, maybe every 3 months, every 6 months, depending on how often you feel that the organizational assets have changed, new people have joined, or new desktops and laptops have come in to warrant a new assessment. But it allows you to, the tool allows you to get a real-time security and compliance posture along with your risk posture at any point in time. The 9-step process, I won't go through this again, but this is all supported in the tool. It's automated. All the threats and vulnerabilities are pre-populated for you. And if you decide to use the existing configuration setting, you can use it as it is. If there are some changes you would like to make, you can make incremental changes. But the task of doing risk analysis and risk assessment is very, very simplified. All you need to do is to list your assets that are important to you, which will be pre-populated again based on a security scan. So your job becomes essentially a question of validating what the system is telling you, and then you can, for example, do a HIPAA security risk analysis, the steps that I talked about, through the tool in a very simple fashion. The system, as I said, automates all of the steps required with pre-canned information, with scanned information, and so your job as an administrator or as a service provider becomes more of validation or making incremental changes to the data that's been detected by the system. Our job as a tool solution provider is to ensure that we bring in automation through software and bring in simplicity to understand the framework without having to deal with all the complex variables that I just talked about. So this is what the dashboard of the tool looks like. Once you've done the scan, once you've done all the assessment, automatically the tool will give you your current security and compliance posture. And by the way, if you're interested in a community edition of the tool, it's available for free on the website. You can go to www.egestalt.com, download the tool, and you'll get a flavor of what the tool can do. It's a free edition which tells you, which gives you limited capabilities in terms of the assets supported, but you'll get a good flavor of the functionality. So I would encourage you to do that if you're interested in exploring further. Talking about the tool, it comes pre-packaged with questionnaires that you can answer yes and no. It comes pre-packaged with policy documents that you can upload as evidence so that you don't have to do it on your own. If you don't have policy documents, you can leverage what's present in the tool, and you can customize it or you can replace it with what you might be using. It comes pre-packaged with business associate agreement, for example, in the HIPAA case, where you're required to have a contract with every BA to be in place as part of HIPAA Omnibus. And we provide you with sample contracts that you can leverage. Excuse me. We have a knowledge base which gives you complete guidance on the citations, the requirements from the government for the regulation. We have best practices that are coming from NIST and other standard bodies that you can leverage. And you can essentially look at vulnerabilities that exist on the assets that were found, the top 10. You can filter them. You can look at also how to fix the problems that are found. So unlike other tools, we tell you the problems and also the solutions to fixing and finding a way to solve the problems. And you can also do what-if analysis, which means that you can look at assets that are grouped by severity. You can do by asset value. So there's lots of knobs available for you to figure out where your expenditure should be, where your focus should be as an organization, so that you're able to fine-tune your efforts to get the maximum ROI. And at the end of it all, you can generate a report on compliance, which is gives you your compliance posture. You can also generate a security report, which gives you your security posture analysis, and this will tell you if you have any vendors that you work with, what's their security and compliance posture and risk exposure. So you have a complete snapshot view of your internal and external security and compliance posture. I know I kind of went through a lot of information, but in closing, what I want to say is that if you want to automate your risk management and security and compliance management tasks, I would urge you to look at Qaegify, which manages all your security and compliance issues. It also does security risk analysis, which you might be required to do as part of HIPAA. And also, if you're interested in getting the federal grant dollars for demonstrating meaningful use, you can take a report out of the tool and submit it to the government for doing so. And if your service provider supports secure GRC, Qaegify, ask them about it, or if you want us to get in touch with them, please do let us know. With that, I have a lot of references here that you can look at as well, which provides more details into what the information that was presented here. And with that, I will open it up for Q&A. Mike?
Okay, great. Thank you, Anupam. Thanks for presenting. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the questions area. Go to webinar and we'll get them answered. Anupam, here's our first question. How is HIPAA Omnibus different from HITECH?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question in terms of, and I've done some webinars on this. I would encourage you to go to egestalt.com under resources webinars that you'll see a webinar on HIPAA Omnibus. But briefly, the major changes that Omnibus has brought about is that along with the covered entities, now business associates also need to be compliant. And the liability of proving compliance is shared between both the covered entities and business associates. And then there have been a number of changes with respect to fines and other regulation enforcement from the government. And I can take it separately if you want to get more details. Happy to discuss it. Please drop me a note at this email address, and we can connect and talk about that in detail.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Anupam. What is construed as willful neglect, and are the fines higher?
Yeah, so the willful neglect from a compliance perspective is really about ignoring the requirement from the government that you need to be HIPAA compliant. So, for example, if you're required to do a security risk analysis and if you don't follow the requirement, then that's considered to be willful neglect. And from a regulation perspective, willful neglect leads to higher fines, and in the tiering of fines, it's the highest tiered fine that you might be imposed on. So it's essentially it's something that needs to be dealt with very, very clearly.
And what are the unique factors, what are the unique features of eGestalt Qaegify's HIPAA solution?
Yeah, so from the risk management perspective, really, as I said earlier, the way our solution differs from the existing state-of-the-art that's out there is that we have pre-packaged a lot of the information. We have followed the standards. We have provided advanced automation tools that allows and takes the burden off the end user or the service provider to deal with security risk analysis. You have the tool which will give you all the information that it gathers through automated scanning and pre-populates the information based on the assets that were discovered, so that your job as a end user and a service provider is just to verify what the information is and to make minimal changes. So compared to the other tools out there, which might take you weeks and months to complete to do a security risk analysis, we expect ours to take maybe days, and it's about 1/5 to 1/10 the cost of other solutions out there, because we priced it in a way that makes it affordable for not only small businesses but large enterprises. So we want to introduce technology and automation to really help solve the problem here.
And how do you price the solution? Maybe you just mentioned that.
Yeah, so we can talk about specifics in a separate call. In terms, it'll be a function of how large the business is, what modules you want to buy. But as I said, we are about 1/10 to 1/20 at the cost in terms of any other solution that's out there. And one of the key drivers of our success is the affordability and the software-based cloud deployment models that makes it easier for service providers to deploy this and remotely manage the whole process. So we can take it offline and discuss it in detail if you're interested in knowing more.
Okay, great. And how strict is the government on the September enforcement date?
Yep, no, I think they're very strict on it, and based on the information that we're getting is that a new audit program will be launched by OCR, Office of Civil Rights, in early Jan 2014. So certainly is going to be enforcement of HIPAA HITECH, and that's a key commitment from the government, assuming the government shutdown ends pretty soon.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks, Anupam. There are no more questions. If you have questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to Anupam at the email address or phone number on the screen there, and we'd be happy to help you answer any of the questions that you might have. We recorded the webinar, and we'll put it up on eGestalt's website at www.egestalt.com, and it should be up there in a day or so. So please check that out. And Anupam, I'll leave the last word with you.
Thank you, Mike. So risk management is a fairly complicated topic, and our intention here is to simplify it, to demystify it, so that you as an end user or a service provider are able to offer these services without having a lot of domain expertise. And really the purpose of the tool is to simplify and make it happen. So I appreciate you coming to the webinar, and please do let us know if there are any other topics that you would like me to cover in the next few weeks when we have the next webinars. Thank you again, and good afternoon to all, and good morning to all. Have a good day.
Great. Thank you, Anupam. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.